Right, in this lecture series, we're going to explore Chapter 10, which is titled Work and Wealth. And in this lecture, we're going to work our way through section 10.1 and 10.2. So by way of the introduction, we'll say that this chapter 10 about work and wealth, takes a close look at how automation, globalization, artificial intelligence, and winner-take-all effects are transforming our workplaces and our communities. So questions then we'll explore answers to are things like these sorts of questions. How has automation affected the pool of jobs? Does globalization really provide more benefits than harms? Will breakthroughs in artificial intelligence lead to significant job losses? Should we be concerned about the rising number of temporary jobs and the emergence of the gig economy? Is there a digital divide or an opportunity gap between those who have access to information technology and those who do not? And do we need to be concerned about winner-take-all effects that are leading to a high concentration of wealth amongst a small proportion of the total population? So in the following sections, we're going to examine issues such as these. All right, section 10.2 is titled Automation and Employment. And some of you probably know that many science fiction writers have described future worlds where machines do much of the non-creative work. And in these science fiction works, that they're trying to paint an optimistic view of these worlds. In Isaac Asimov's short stories and novels, technology is seen as a tool for the betterment of mankind. And in this sci-fi universe, intelligent robots may be disliked by some people, but they are not a threat. And this is because they have the 3 laws of robotics etched into their positronic brains. Bonus points if you know what those 3 laws are, but they guarantee that the robot will never turn against their creators. Other writers, such as Kurt Vonnegut Jr., describe dystopias. So Vonnegut's Player Piano concerns a future America in which nearly all manufacturing jobs have been lost to automation. And people wind up hating machines for taking away their feelings of self-worth, yet their fascination with automation makes its triumph appear inevitable. So then, what's the relationship between automation and job destruction? Well, automation has been blamed for the loss of both manufacturing and white-collar jobs, as well as an increase in the length of the work week for salaried employees. Manufacturing employment peaked in the United States in 1979 with 19.4 million jobs. And then by 2011, manufacturing employment had dropped 40% to 11.7 million, even though the population of the United States had increased 39% during the same time period. And the percentage of American workers involved in manufacturing has dropped significantly from 35% in 1947 to 8% in 2016. And the effects of automation have been felt in the office work environment too. Email, voicemail, and high-speed copy machines eliminate secretarial and clerical positions. Even some jobs requiring advanced degrees seem to be vulnerable because spreadsheets and other software packages reduce the need for accountants and bookkeepers. And in fact, the economic recovery of 1991 to 1996 was notable because of the large number of white-collar middle management jobs that were eliminated even as the economy grew. So unlike the recession of the early 1980s, most of the people whose jobs were eliminated in the 1990s had at least some college education. A large number of these jobs were occupied by people making more than $50,000, and only 35% of these higher paid victims of downsizing were able to find jobs that paid as well. And there's also a trend involving working harder and making less because inflation adjusted household incomes were flat between 1979 and 1994, even though the work week got longer. Harvard economist Juliet Schor reports that between 1970 and 1990, the average American increased the number of hours spent at work per year by 163, and that, of course, is equal to an extra month at work every year. Some people believe longer work hours are a consequence of corporate downsizing, which is facilitated by the introduction of automation and information technology, which is sketched out visually in figure 10.2 on the PowerPoint slide here. And so what it is depicting is the logic that when an organization sheds some of its workers, the work that needs to be done is divided among fewer employees, and so there's a natural tendency for the number of hours worked to increase. In addition, the fact that people have been laid off is a strong incentive for those who remain to work harder so that they won't be part of the next layoff. All right, so there's also perhaps a positive relationship between automation and job creation. Traditional economists hold a quite different view about the effects of automation and information technology on jobs. They have concluded that while new technology may destroy certain jobs, it also creates new jobs so that the net result is an increase, not a decrease, in the number of available jobs. So on the surface, it is obvious that automation eliminates certain jobs. That's simply what automation means, almost by definition. However, it's also important to look beneath the surface because automation is introduced as a cost-saving measure, so it's less expensive for a machine to perform a particular job compared to a human being in most cases. And because companies compete with each other, lower production costs results in lower prices for the consumer. So that's a positive outcome. And then the drop in the price of the product has three further beneficial effects. First, it increases the demand for the product. So in order to produce more of the product, workers must be hired. Secondly, people who are already purchasing the product don't have to pay as much for it, and that gives them more money to spend on other things, increasing the demand for other products, and this too results in job creation. And thirdly, some people must be employed who are designing, creating, and servicing the automated devices themselves. And Martin Carnoy disputes the notion that people are working longer hours now than they used to. He says, workers today work much less than those of a century ago, but they produce more, earn substantially more, and have access to a greater variety of jobs. So technology displaced workers, but also contributed to a much higher labor productivity and the production of new products, which helped create new jobs, economic growth, and higher incomes. So what are some of the effects of increase in productivity? Well, productivity in the United States doubled between 1948 and 1990, and Juliet Schor asks us to consider what our society could have done with this dramatic increase in productivity. And it turns out that we could have maintained our 1948 standard of living and gone to a 4-hour workday or a 6-month work year. Or every worker could be taking every other year off with pay. But instead of taking the path of working less, the average work week actually rose slightly. And as a result, Americans in 1990 owned and consumed twice as much as in 1948, but had less free time in which to enjoy these things. So American society is remarkable for how hard its citizens work. The number of hours worked per year in the United States is significantly higher than the number of hours worked in France or Germany, for example. And it also appears modern Americans work harder than the ancient Greeks, Romans, or Western Europeans of the Middle Ages. Compared to medieval Europeans or modern Bushmen, we have vastly superior healthcare systems, educational institutions, and transportation networks. We also live in climate controlled environments, and we have an incredible number of choices with respect to where we travel, what we wear, what we eat, and how we entertain ourselves. But the cost of these freedoms and luxuries is less leisure time. So, despite our high standard of living, our expectations about what we ought to have continue to rise. And in 1964, the average new American home had 1,470 square feet and one television set, and only about 20% of new homes had air conditioning. But in 2001, the size of the average new home had risen to 2,100 square feet, and nearly 100% of new homes were equipped with air conditioning. And the typical family home had 2 or 3 television sets. And so, in order to maintain this increasing lifestyle of freedoms and luxuries, people are working harder and therefore losing their leisure time. All right, let's look at a case study called the canceled vacation, or a scenario analysis. So here are the relevant non-moral facts. So Stuart works as a software developer for a startup company in Seattle. He is well compensated, but the high salary comes at a price. It is a pressure-packed environment, and everybody is working at least 60 hours a week. The official company policy is that every employee receives 3 weeks of paid vacation per year. However, Stuart and the other software developers in his group have never taken that much time off because there always seems to be an important deadline looming, and the group supervisor has a knack for getting people to cancel or curtail their vacations in order to help meet these deadlines. And of course, the workers are reluctant to be labeled as the less dedicated. So some of the employees in Stuart's group have not taken any vacation time in over 2 years. And 6 months ago, Stuart learned his parents would be moving from San Diego back to Australia, and he decided it would be good to visit them before they moved so far away. And at that time, Stuart asked his supervisor for permission to spend a week in San Diego, and his boss approved the request. Stuart hoped to surprise his parents, and for that reason, he did not tell them that he was planning to come. But a week before Stuart's trip to San Diego, his boss called him into his office, and he asked Stuart to cancel his vacation in order to help get an important product update completed by the deadline. He offers Stuart round-trip airfare to Australia, and he promises Stuart he can have his full 3 weeks vacation next year to see his parents. Stuart complies with his supervisor's request and cancels the vacation to San Diego. And so the moral question here is, did Stuart do anything morally wrong? Well, according to Kantianism or social contract theory, it's hard to see how he could have how we could build a case that Stuart did something morally wrong, and this is because he didn't break any promises and he didn't deceive anyone, and he wasn't obligated to visit his parents before they moved from San Diego to Australia, especially because he hadn't told them explicitly or made explicit plans with them. How about from an act utilitarian perspective? Well, we know that Stuart gave up a week in San Diego and the displeasure of his boss in return for the appreciation of his boss, and he also gained 3 weeks in Australia and free airfare. And as we saw in section 2.7.2, a complete act utilitarian analysis requires us to consider 7 attributes of expected results, and those were the intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. And The intensity, fecundity, and extent of the two alternatives are similar, so we will focus on the remaining 4 attributes. So let's begin by considering the duration of the 2 vacations. So if Stuart goes to San Diego, he will be with his parents for 1 week, but if he waits and goes to Australia, he will be with his parents for 3 weeks. And so the trip to Australia is the much better choice from the perspective of the duration of the pleasure. And so now let's look at the purity of each option. We know that if Stuart goes to San Diego, he knows he will be worrying about his upset boss, and that will reduce the purity of the experience. He would like to think that he will be able to go to Australia next year without worrying about his boss being mad at him, but since his manager has a history of asking people to curtail or cancel vacations, that's probably unrealistic. In fact, since the trip to Australia is 3 times as long as the trip to San Diego, Stuart is likely to spend the entire trip with worries about his boss's attitude in the back of his mind. And so we might be able to reasonably conclude that the 2 vacations are equivalent from the perspective of the purity of pleasure. And the trip to San Diego is much closer in time than the trip to Australia, so from the perspective of propinquity, it is the much better choice. And then finally, we'll consider the certainty of the 2 experiences. Stuart's manager didn't actually forbid him from traveling to San Diego, so that trip was certain. But the trip to Australia is much less certain than the trip to San Diego, given the track record of Stuart's manager. And looking only at the certainty of the 2 alternatives, the decision to delay the vacation and travel to Australia was the wrong choice. So in summary, the duration of the Australian vacation is the greatest benefit of that choice. And when we consider the propinquity and certainty of the 2 experiences, Stuart would have been better off sticking with his original plan and visiting his parents in San Diego. So from an act utilitarian point of view, Stuart seems to have made the morally wrong decision. Okay, what would a virtue ethicist think of Stuart's decision? Well, Stuart demonstrated a lack of courage and a lack of consideration for himself, his coworkers, and his parents when he let himself be bullied by his supervisor or pressured. So by caving into his boss's request, he let down himself and his fellow employees by making it just that much more difficult for any of them to get a vacation. And in addition, he deprived his parents of the pleasure of his company for at least a year and maybe longer. So from the perspective of virtue ethics, Stuart would seem to have made a morally wrong decision. Okay, so let's say something about automation and the future of robots. So while automation has not yet shortened the work week of the typical American, some experts maintain that most jobs will eventually be taken over by machines. And in fact, the roboticist Hans Moravec predicts that by 2050, robots will have replaced human workers not just in manufacturing jobs, but in decision-making roles too. Artificial intelligence is the subdiscipline of computer science that focuses on developing systems that can perform tasks otherwise requiring human intelligence. And much current research in artificial intelligence is focused on deep learning, or developing computer systems that can learn from experience to improve their performance in such challenging problem domains as speech recognition, language translation, and self-driving vehicles. Robotics is an interdisciplinary field of engineering and computer science that focuses on the development of autonomous machines that can perform actions otherwise carried out by humans. And according to Moravec, developments in artificial intelligence and robotics were held back for decades by inadequate computer power, but rapid increases in microprocessor speeds allowed computer scientists to implement more sophisticated algorithms that have achieved many breakthroughs. So here are a few notable achievements in artificial intelligence and robotics since 1995. The first one is a minivan equipped with a video camera and a portable workstation drove from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to San Diego, California. In 1995, the computer was in control of the steering wheel 98.2% of the time. Another achievement involves the IBM supercomputer called Deep Blue, and this computer defeated world chess champion Garry Kasparov in a six-game match in 1997. In 2000, Japanese automaker Honda created a Simo, the first humanoid robot or android capable of ascending and descending stairs. And another notable accomplishment involves the Swedish appliance giant Electrolux. They introduced Trilobite, the world's first domestic robotic floor vacuum cleaner, in 2001. And then Stanley, a robotic car developed at Stanford University, and four other autonomous vehicles successfully completed a rugged 128-mile course through the Nevada desert in 2005. And what was even more notable is that Stanley was the fastest vehicle to finish the race, averaging about 19 miles per hour. And then another achievement involves the AI program named Watson, who in February of 2011 was running on an IBM supercomputer, and Watson easily defeated the two most successful human Jeopardy champions in history, Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter. And then another achievement happened between 2009 and 2015 when self-driving cars developed by Google logged more than 1 million miles in autonomous mode without a single accident caused by the self-driving car. And then finally, in May of 2017, the AlphaGo program created by Google defeated Key-G, the world's #1 Go player, in a multi-game match. All right, so here are some moral questions related to robotics. We know that the roboticist Hans Moravec predicts that these innovations are just the beginning of a new era in automation. In 30 years, inexpensive desktop computers will be 1,000,000 times faster than today's models, allowing them to run sophisticated AI programs capable of deep learning. Moravec writes, in the 21st century, inexpensive but capable robots will displace human labor so broadly that the average workday will have to plummet to practically zero to keep everyone usefully employed. And Moravec predicts humans will retire to a world of luxurious lassitude. So perhaps Moravec has a grossly inflated view of what robots may be able to do in 30 years, but what if he is right? The changes he is predicting would profoundly affect our society. And so for this reason, Richard Epstein suggests there is an urgent need to discuss ethical issues related to the creation of intelligent robots before they become a reality. And so here are some of the important ethical questions Epstein raises that we should be discussing. So first off, is it wrong to create machines capable of making human labor obsolete? Second, will humans become demoralized by the presence of vastly more intelligent robots? And if so, is it wrong to work on the development of such robots? Third, is it morally acceptable to work on the development of an intelligent machine if we cannot be sure that the machine's actions will be benevolent? Fourth, how will we ensure that intelligent robots will not be put to an evil purpose by a malevolent human? Fifth, how will our notions of intellectual property change if computers become capable of creative work? And then finally, how will our ideas about privacy have to change if legions of super-fast computers are analyzing the electronic records of our lives? Michael Lashat evaluates the issue in the following way. He says, some people would like to try to construct a personal AI, which is a machine that is conscious of its own existence, so it can think its own thoughts, think for itself. But no one has proven this cannot be done, so let's assume it's theoretically possible. And in fact, the dominant view in cognitive science and philosophy of mind is something called metaphysical functionalism. which says that mental states are defined by what they do rather than what they're made out of. And so not only is this theoretically possible to have a personal AI, but it's in line with the dominant view of the nature of mental states in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. So we would want to know even more urgently, perhaps, then, is it morally acceptable to attempt to construct a personal AI? Here's one line of reasoning to consider in answering that question. So, according to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, we should always treat other persons as ends in themselves, including our own selves, and never treat other persons or ourselves merely as a means to an end. So, in the attempt to construct a personal AI, perhaps scientists would be treating the personal AI they created as a means to the end of increasing scientific knowledge. And it's reasonable to assume that a fully conscious personal AI would be unwilling to accept its status as a piece of property as persons like ourselves are. So in this case, owning a personal AI would be a form of exploitation. And Leshat concedes that this line of reasoning rests on the controversial assumption that a conscious machine would or should be given the same moral status as a human being, but the argument assumes that a personal AI would also have free will and the ability to make moral choices if we're reasoning under some sort of Kantian deontology. And perhaps any system, though, operated by a computer program does not have free will because it has no choice other than to execute the program's instructions as dictated by the architecture of the CPU. And we do not know whether scientists and engineers will ever be able to construct a personal AI, even if it's theoretically possible. And we cannot say whether a personal AI would possess free will in advance. And partly this is uncertain as well because our predictions would depend on whether or not anything else is known, in reality, is known to have free will. And most philosophers and neuroscientists would argue that we do not have free will in the Kantian sense, that we have some sort of special causal power that transcends or is independent of the laws of nature or our evolutionary dispositions and genetic dispositions that have been shaped by evolution. And so it's important to note that the mainstream opinion in the artificial intelligence research community holds that despite amazing progress developing AI systems capable of things like language, translation, driving vehicles, and much more, that we are at least decades away from creating an AI system capable of exhibiting intelligent behavior that is at least as advanced as a human person across the full range of cognitive tasks. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about these ethical issues that were already raised. And so concerns persist that at some point in the future, machines exhibiting artificial intelligence could bring about the issues in the questions we've already raised, but also something perhaps even more of an existential risk to our existence is if the artificial intelligence reaches this inflection point called the technological singularity. And that's the point at which the machines would enter into a cycle of rapid self-improvement outside of human control, creating their own superintelligences that threaten humanity. And in an interview with the BBC, the late renowned theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking said that the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race.